The fight for dignity is realized by having agency and having equality. Agency plus equality is equal to dignity.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. The 2024 PovertyCure Summit, Dignity, Agency, and Charity was a virtual event put on by Acton's Center for Social Flourishing. Over 2 days, participants learned from scholars and practitioners involved in the global struggle against poverty and against toxic charity that hinders people's ability to rise. On today's episode, we bring to you the keynote presented by Dr. William Easterly entitled Beyond Material Progress, Markets and Dignity in the Fight Against Global Poverty. As material living standards improve in the developing world, are the people there better able to pursue their own aspirations and desires, or less? You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
So welcome everyone to the 2024 PovertyCure Summit. My name is Michael Matheson Miller. I'm a senior research fellow here at the Acton Institute and the director of PovertyCure and our new Center for Social Flourishing. Thank you all for joining today, and we have a lot of people watching online, so thank you for joining. This is the third PovertyCure Summit that we've done. We started this in 2020 during COVID as completely online, but in 2022 and this year, we're happy to have a hybrid event where we have people here, of course, at the Acton Institute and people from online watching from all over the world. And we're very delighted to bring you an excellent lineup of speakers. It is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker today, Professor William Easterly. Professor Easterly is a professor of economics at New York University. He is the co-director of the NYU Development Research Institute, which won the 2009 BBVA Frontiers of Knowledge Development Cooperation Award. He is the author of 3 books, Tyranny of Experts, How Economist Dictators and the Forgotten Rights of the Poor, The White Man's Burden, Why the West's Efforts to Aid the Rest Have Done So Much Ill and So Little Good, and this won the F.A. Hayek Award, and a book called The Elusive Quest for Growth. Professor Easterly is a highly cited researcher. He has published more than 60 peer-reviewed academic articles, has written columns and reviews for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, the New York Review of Books, and the Washington Post. He has served as the co-editor of the Journal of Development Economics and as director of the blog AidWatch. He is a research associate at NBER with many other titles that you can read about in his biography, but he is also, and this is very important, the 11th most famous native of Bowling Green, Ohio. So it's very important. Now, when I was in graduate school studying international development in the mid-90s, I got there and I was very enthusiastic, and I'm going to say pretty straightforward. Almost everybody was kind of like a socialist or a planner or everything, and I was a little bit overwhelmed, and there was no one around. And in fact, one of the reasons we did PovertyCure is I thought, well, if we could build something that would have helped me 20 years ago, that would be great. But there was really one person that I found, and there were probably some others. I mean, Thomas Sowell had done some things, Michael Novak had done some things, but really the only person really doing development economics at that time was Peter Bauer, great Peter Bauer. And I found a Bauer book in the London bookstore, at a used bookstore. And this was kind of all there was, and I was alone. And not anymore, because soon after that, Bill Easterly wrote super important books, really addressing and challenging the dominant model, echoing some of the work of P.T. Bauer and other great thinkers. And so I've told Bill, I said, if I was a little younger and he was a little older, I would have run over as quickly as I could to NYU and asked to be a student. That didn't happen, but I'm glad to get to know Bill over the last couple of years, and I'm always happy to learn from him and gain from his insights. And so it's my honor and pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Professor William Easterly.
Thanks, Michael, for that great introduction. I want to talk about us going beyond material progress. What does that mean, and how can we get there? Let me start with a story. This is a story that came about because in 1972, Idi Amin expelled all Ugandan citizens of Asian origin. A lot of them wound up as refugees in England, in particular in a refugee camp right in London. One of the refugees, Mahmoud Mamdani, later wrote about his experiences there. And one story that was particularly salient to me when I read this is a time when the directors of the refugee camp decided that they were going to move 50 of the refugees with only 13 hours notice to another refugee camp 60 miles from London, which is not super convenient because a lot of them already had jobs in London. And Mahmoud Mamdani led sort of a refugee revolt at this point and said, you know, we don't like being treated this way, getting 13 hours notice to move against our will away from our own jobs. He said, we protest about being treated as objects. So exactly what Michael was saying. And when the camp directors kind of reacted in a very hostile way, he thought what had most offended them is the idea that Mahmoud Mamdani and his fellow rebels had refused to act as refugees, as helpless, well-behaved children, devoid of initiative, just grateful for any material benefits. And he acknowledged that the camps were very generous about material benefits. They even gave them a Christmas turkey at Christmas time. But Mahmoud Mamdani said that was not enough, that they'd lost all their possessions in this process, but they still had one possession, which was their self-respect. And they were not willing to give that up. For that last possession, our humanity, we were willing to fight. So this kind of embodies the idea that there is something more than just getting material benefits for a recipient of an aid program. There's some more primary need for some kind of self-respect. Today, we would call this agency in kind of the rather unfortunate, wonky term that we have for what Mahmoud Mamdani was complaining about. The extreme poor, according to the Nobel laureates Banerjee and Duflo, they start to recognize more and more that the extreme poor are often robbed of their dignity and their agency. That there's a demand for agency and not just a demand for income. Now, of course, I'm not denying for a moment the values that I and most of us who work on development and all the beneficiaries of development and virtually everyone, the values that less material poverty is a good thing, that we do value reductions in material poverty, we do value increases in material income. So what we're talking about today is not a substitute for that value, but an addition to it. That there's also a demand not only for escaping poverty, but a demand for dignity and agency. Now, I have to admit at the beginning that for most of my career, I reacted pretty hostilely to this concept, particularly when there were a lot of other buzzwords that were offered by the aid community for this concept, which usually just caused me to roll my eyes and not get terribly convinced by this. Words like empowerment, community-driven development, participatory development, consultations with stakeholders. You know, we don't see too many freedom marches that say we demand consultations with stakeholders for greater agency. We don't usually see those placards in freedom marches. I think some more compelling words that will start to tie in with the historical fight for this is individual liberty. These are all things I think of as very implicated in the word agency. Individual liberty, freedom, choice, consent, self-determination, dignity, and respect. And as often happens with liberal ideas, I think we can understand liberal ideals best by thinking what are their opposites, The opposites are coercion, condescension, humiliation, disrespect, contempt. Those words have a lot more visceral charge than the word agency does, so it gives us a good idea of what we're looking for. So what I want to do in this talk is give you some examples of cases where material income was perhaps even increased, but was done in a way that agency was taken away. So the historical examples I'm going to give you are pretty drastic and extreme. And I'm not going to argue that aid efforts today are in any way similar or equivalent to these extreme violations of agency, because I'm talking about conquest of indigenous peoples, slavery, colonialism, and the 20th century communism, were all examples of extreme denial of agency in the name of often increasing material income. So what we do see in this, that we can't, in the light of this history, we can't think of agency as some arcane concern that a few refugees in London had, that had sort of peculiar taste, that they cared so much about their own dignity and agency. Far from being some kind of arcane concern, the fight for agency has been one of the biggest fights and one of the biggest issues of all of global development and progress. So we're not talking about some little concern. We're talking about what has been a big concern for over 2 centuries. So let's start with the idea of conquest of indigenous peoples. So the incoming settlers of the Americas often tried to present what they were bringing somewhat implausibly as a sort of a development program for the Native Americans that they were coming to. And this picture is the seal of the Massachusetts Bay Colony that was adopted in the 1600s. And imagined an Indian with the words saying, "Come over and help us." We don't know a lot about this Indian. We don't know what tribe he belonged to. We don't know anything about his background, possibly because he was entirely a fictional creation. Now, Adam Smith actually acknowledged and celebrated the fact that material development had been a great success, especially in the North American colonies. Yet at the same time, he had a somewhat moral rejection of the success. He called the process of conquest one of savage injustice that had been ruinous and destructive to several of these unfortunate countries. And he offered something that really could have changed history if it had been more widely adopted, and did change history to the extent it was partially adopted, is there was an alternative to a conquest that we could just think of as commerce instead of conquest. This process could have been mutually beneficial, he lamented, if only there had been a new set of exchanges of trade, of commerce between Native Americans and Europeans, which would naturally have proved as advantageous to the new continent as it certainly did to the old continent. And Smith, and this is a really crucial point today, is Smith saw markets as precisely satisfying the demand for agency. He saw sort of 3 values very, very much that embodied agency that were satisfied by markets. One is that just the process of exchange is a process of mutual consent. Whoever offers to me a bargain of any kind proposes to do this. Give me that which I want, and you shall have that which you want. That there's mutual consent in the exchange. Second, that there's self-determination on both sides. Each side is in charge of themselves, deciding what they want from the exchange. And Adam Smith said it is fit and right that it should be so. So this was something that valued agency as an end in itself and not merely a means to higher material enrichment. And third, there was equality between both sides of the exchange. There was no saying one side is superior to the other and deserves to get a better deal or deserves to impose their wishes on the other party. Both sides are equal in the exchange. And Adam Smith generalized this, and you can see in reading The Wealth of Nations and Theory of Moral Sentiments that he covered all of humanity in doing this, that every man should be left perfectly free to pursue his own interest in his own way. So at this point, Adam Smith is suggesting there's something besides material progress that should be a value in and of itself, a sort of moral value. And that is these three principles, and in general, the idea of agency. That markets and development itself needs these moral boundaries in order to be credibly a benevolent force. Now, I have to admit at this point, there's some discomfort in talking about moral debates. Moral debates sound like I have a morally superior position, and my opponents are moral bankrupts who have an inferior position. That's not a terribly credible kind of argument. It's unlikely to be persuasive. It's even less persuasive that we think of economists as materially superior beings. And my own quest to be recognized as a morally superior being has been largely unsuccessful so far. And yet there's something going on here that I don't have to, fortunately, I'm being rescued by a very large and long tradition of two groups of people. First of all, economists that fight for liberal values, and second of all, by the group of people that partly inspired them, that people fighting for their own right to consent, people fighting for their own right to self-determination, people fighting for their own equality. And these fights kind of bring home to us that agency and freedom and liberty and consent and self-determination and equality are goods that are seen as good in and of themselves. And when they conflict with material income, there are some times when people choose the agency and give up the income, or are willing to choose the agency and give up the income. So let's just summarize at this point. We have these sort of two alternative ways in which the West started to interact with the rest of the world. We have conquest, we have commerce. Conquest is coercion, commerce is consent. Conquest is paternalism, commerce is self-determination. Conquest is superiority, commerce is equality. And what's even more remarkable, when I discovered this quote from Adam Smith, I got super, super inspired. Adam Smith foresaw, writing in 1776, Adam Smith foresaw that someday there would be a world in which there was much greater recognition of the equal right to consent. He foresaw a day that the inhabitants of all the different quarters of the world, and it's striking how Adam Smith is including all peoples in this hope and this prophecy. And someday the injustice of independent nations would change into some sort of respect for the rights of one another. And the way he saw this happening was precisely an extensive commerce from all countries to all countries. So the key point of this talk, the key point of the work that I am most excited by and involved in and dedicated to at this point, as are many others, is that commerce between individuals and nations is a way for both sides to have agency. And that classical liberal thinkers on markets were going to do inspire us by having played a key role in debates on huge topics like Indian removal, slavery, colonialism, and communism. So let me give you some examples. Slavery is perhaps the most drastic example of a case where there were some claims of material benefits, but a radical denial of agency. So slave owners claim, maybe rather implausibly, that slavery raised material income of slaves, comparing slaves in the Americas to people who had not been enslaved still in Africa, or sometimes comparing the material consumption of slaves to the white working class in America or Britain. So we could easily dismiss these claims as being very biased and self-interested. What's interesting is there have been a lot of non-slave owners who agreed, including some liberated ex-slaves. Like one I've listed here is a 18th century campaigner against slavery named Ottobah Cugoano. So people like Adam Smith, the Nobel laureate historian Robert Fogel, Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, have actually agreed that it is possible that the material consumption of slaves could have been higher. Now, what's important at this point is not, of course we could have a huge debate. We could see these claims as malicious and we could have a huge debate about whether that's true. But the point here is that even people who thought it was true were still campaigning vigorously against slavery, of course, and the reason they were doing so is they knew that enslaved people demanded not only income, but demanded freedom. So that is a crystal clear, extreme example when freedom is superior value is demanded, even if it was true that material income increased, there would still be this huge demand for freedom. And when Frederick Douglass became a major abolitionist advocate, especially during the Civil War, he made clear what was the opposite to slavery. The opposite to slavery was precisely self-determination. He asked rhetorically what a lot of the white reformers were asking: what shall be done with the 4 million slaves if they are emancipated? And his answer was pretty radical and shocking to those who listened to his speeches at that time. He said, our answer is do nothing with them. Mind your own business and let them mind theirs. Not necessarily rejecting any kind of material aid to ex-slaves after the end of slavery, but forcefully rejecting paternalism. Paternalism might be worse than doing nothing for ex-slaves, even if it was offering material benefits, and asserting instead this demand for self-determination. So here's his view of more of self-determination as pretty much a free labor market, free trade, and property rights. So if you see a black American who wants to purchase land, let him alone. If you see a black American on his way to the workshop, let him alone, let him work. And the paternalism was very visceral for Frederick Douglass. This is an image that was actually popular earlier in the abolitionist cause in Britain, which was a good cause, but was presented in this image in a very paternalistic way, the way that Frederick Douglass forcefully rejected. The idea of a prostrate form, the cringing attitude, the outstretched hand of beggary does not become an American freeman. We will not consent, he said, to being any longer represented in that position. So then we move from the claim of benevolent slavery to the claim of benevolent colonialism. King Leopold, when he was beginning the colonization of what is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the Congo colony of Belgium, he claimed that his objective was to civilize the Congo, which is a word that people used in those years as a synonym for development. Civilize meant develop. And yeah, he was super successful in raising the GDP of the Congo. There was a huge expansion of rubber exports, huge increase in GDP of the Congo. Unfortunately, that was done through forced labor of millions of Congolese. It was done by land confiscation from the Congolese. It was done actually with a ban on free trade by both Europeans and Congolese. Were not allowed to have free trade in rubber. The rubber was confiscated by state enterprises that took the rubber, seized the rubber, forced the labor, and exported the rubber. The Congo Reform Association that opposed Leopold, they did so by promoting free labor, free trade, and property rights. So this is another case where material income was not enough to claim that there was an increase in human well-being, and the alternative was, in this case, was free labor and free trade. So we're used to thinking of free labor and free trade and free markets today as being something on the right opposed to something on the left. What's interesting in these historical cases is laissez-faire markets were on the left opposed to what was on the right. The right was for imposing authority, coercion, slavery, colonialism, etc. So William Grant Sumner is another economist who came along. Many of you have not heard of his name. There is a way in which advocates for these values that I'm talking about today quickly get marginalized and then quickly forgotten. So that may not be super inspiring to you if you want to pursue your own intellectual career. This may not be the most promising avenue for you if I'm giving you tons of examples of people who get quickly marginalized, obscure, and quickly forgotten. You may want to go in another direction. Speaking from personal experience, possibly. So William Graham Sumner summarized this when he was criticizing what was happening in 1898, which was the American conquest and colonization of the Philippines. He summarized the colonial attitude as saying, "We know what is best for you better than you know yourself, and we're going to make you do it." It's paternalism plus coercion taking away agency. This was the mindset that continued after World War I with the Versailles Treaty, which in the language of the actual Versailles Treaty, there's this language about some lands are inhabited by peoples, unfortunately not yet able to stand by themselves. And supposedly the development of such peoples was the objective of now having even more new colonies, was a sacred trust of the civilized countries to do to the supposedly uncivilized countries. And so colonialism expanded in later 19th and the early 20th century. What was tragic about this is one guy who is pictured here, was greatly rejoiced at the Versailles Treaty, the way that it was yes, 10 minutes, thank you. Rejoiced at the Versailles Treaty, the way that it had created a great opening for the communists to appeal to the desire for self-determination and sell sort of Marxist-Leninist ideas as being the essence of anti-colonialism. There was an alternative of Ludwig von Mises, who had forcefully denounced colonialism for the same reasons as William Graham Sumner did, that it was the toxic combination of paternalism and coercion. And von Mises called forcefully for the complete liberation of the colonies from despotic rule. But the tragedy is that Leninists, rather than liberals, captured the anti-colonial movement with kind of lasting damage that we're still experiencing today. But eventually, communism was also defeated, mostly, except for a huge exception in a place called China, but mostly defeated at least in Eastern Europe and Russia, the former Soviet Union, and mostly defeated in the sense that at least Stalinist central planning was going to be discontinued. And it was done so precisely and partly by the same kind of quest for agency and dignity. Václav Havel, the first leader of post-communist Czechoslovakia, summarized this as how communism had denigrated man into a production force. Just as Michael was saying in his introduction, communism dehumanized man by seeing man as a means to greater GDP for the great Soviet nation, as a means to increasing production under central planning through massive forced labor, through massive gulags and forced labor on every side. This is yet another case where material income was increased and yet was not an increase in human well-being because it was such a radical denial of freedom and agency. And to everyone's surprise, the subject peoples under communism eventually did not take this lying down, and Havel said the acquiescent, humiliated Czechoslovak people had suddenly overthrown the totalitarian system in a completely decent and peaceful way. And the key word here is humiliated. Communism was a humiliation for the citizens. And the demand to escape humiliation is a powerful human need that may be even greater than the demand for material income. So let me give you two big graphs that kind of summarize the story at this point. The first big graph is the one very familiar to you and to all of us who work on development. This is the decline in poverty rates in every region. You can't read the text, so let me just make it up as I go along. The vertical axis is the poverty rate, the percent of people that are in extreme poverty. And the horizontal axis is just time from 1820 to the present. And each line represents a different region of the world. So you can see there's been this universal and tremendous and a trend that deserves to be dramatically celebrated, and for which, another theme we could talk about, freedom does deserve a lot of the credit for this. So this is the usual story that we talk about, this dramatic decline in extreme poverty rates. But what I'm talking about today is a second hugely important trend that has happened over time, and this has been the rise of agency, the rise of freedom. So I'm giving you a bunch of lines here The gray line is the index of the number of people subjected to the British slave trade. What color is that line? The black line is new colony, the number of indigenous people that died or were killed in new colonies over time. The yellow line is the number of African American slaves in the U.S. So the first great victory of liberals was the abolition of slavery, and the first great victory of people fighting for their own liberty was the abolition of slavery. The end of the British slave trade in 1808, the abolition of slavery in 1865. But then we had the rise of colonialism, but then that too was eventually, that's the blue line, but that too was eventually defeated. Then we had the rise of communism, that's the little green line, percent of the world's nations that are communist. That too was eventually defeated. And what replaced all these coercive interactions between the West and the rest, what replaced them was the rise of commerce. The red line, the spectacular increase in the red line, which is graphed on the right-hand side axis, is the spectacular increase in exports from Asia and Africa that happened largely in the late 20th century, in the second half of the 20th century. So indeed, Adam Smith's prophecy has at least partially come true. This is another thing that's worth celebrating in the same way that material prosperity coming out of poverty is worth celebrating. So let me go quickly to a little bit where we are today. So Amartya Sen has argued that, also joined the chorus of saying freedom is an end in itself. If we appreciated the freedom more, we would also appreciate more the market mechanism. And there's this long line of economists, only a few of which I've been able to quote, listed here, that have fought for freedom as an end in itself over many years. And yet they've been largely unsuccessful so far in getting freedom adopted as an end in itself in the development community or even in the wider economics community. And so they've been unsuccessful in getting freedom and agency recognized as a basic human need, as an end in itself. But what I'll close with is talking about the Senegalese entrepreneur, remarkable thinker named Magatte Wade, who writes about her conversation, her perspective on aid that she started to get not only from more formal study, but just from interactions with Westerners. She described her conversation with a venture capitalist that she was trying to get money from for her admirable enterprise in Senegal. And the venture capitalist said, but don't we need to be, you want money for a private enterprise, but don't we need to be digging wells for poor children? And Magatte Wade thought kind of bitterly that for him, helping Africa just meant providing charity for the poor, pathetic African children he had seen in lots of NGO marketing campaigns. This picture here is a kind of notorious picture. It's fortunately not quite as widespread today. That was accompanying the 1984 Live Aid concert for aid to Ethiopia during a famine. We see here in the foreground two sort of emaciated African children being contrasted with the happy British children in the background. That's the kind of image that Magatte Wade found very disrespectful, insulting, degrading. She said she would have preferred just having a negotiation of a tough business deal and not receiving charity. But her attempt to kind of convey these points has been like all the other liberals, have been relatively unsuccessful. She says when she speaks about the dignity and respect Africans deserve, yes, she sometimes gets standing ovation from African and African diaspora audiences because they also feel the pain and disrespect of these stereotypes. But when she speaks about these themes to Euro-American audiences, she just gets these blank stares asking me, but what about the wells? So that's sort of where we are today. But the remarkable thing that has happened over time, as we already saw from the graph celebrating the rise of agency, is even when these marginalized and obscure and forgotten liberals argue for freedom as an end in itself, they seem to be so unsuccessful in the intellectual debate. Somehow freedom does succeed anyway, despite their unsuccess in the intellectual debate. Maybe that's because people do fight so hard for freedom for themselves. And here I'll give you a graph summarizing the state of things in aid to Africa today. Aid is the the little bar on the right, and the bar on the left is the sum of all market-based interactions between Africa and the rest of the world. It's the sum of remittances from migrants, foreign direct investment, and exports from Africa to the rest of the world. So the market-based flows for Africa are over 5 times larger than the aid flows for Africa. The typical African is not an aid recipient. Typical African is engaged in market-based flows with the rest of the world. So to summarize the whole talk, I just want to give you my attempt to come up with an equation that's my equivalent to E equals MC squared. And the equation I'm going to offer you is agency plus equality equals dignity. The fight for dignity is realized by having agency and having equality. Agency plus equality is equal to dignity. At this point, if I make my own lame attempt to be a little more successful than previous advocates for freedom, I think I would reach for something eloquent to say in closing, like paraphrasing the words of another great advocate for liberty, Abraham Lincoln, that where we should go from here is that we should here highly resolve that development shall have a new birth of freedom, and that development of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Thank you.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important because it lets us know what topics you are interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Mark Townsend.